Okay, here we are for the video lecture on chapters 5 through 7. You guys gave me some great questions this go around, so I'll dive right into them. Um, uh, the first one is, how did the baths lead to the decline of Rome? I think it's interesting that the person who asked this question focused on the baths. Um, the Roman baths were these enormous public, institutions where people just hung out naked and bathed in hot water and cold water and all kinds of different things. It was kind of a marvel of plumbing, if you will. Um, how did they had a lot of sophisticated engineering to get that much water. Some of it heated, some of it cooled, right, all in the same place. Um, but during the decline of Rome, one of the things that was going on was Rome was becoming Christianized, right? Christianity had happened, and Rome, for many years, tried to stomp Christianity out, and it just kept on growing in popularity. And there's a history there that your book gives us some of. But you can kind of see how the Christian ethic and the Roman ethic, the pagan Roman ethic, would clash mightily over an issue like the public baths. Um, most of the critics of Rome in that age were the early Christians. And I've been reading a lot of St. Augustine lately. He's got a book called The City of God. Augustine wrote in the mid 4th century or late 4th century. He was there for the sack of Rome when the Goths came through and tore the place down. Um, and at that time, there was a lot of turmoil because there was still a large portion of the population that was pagan, and this growing and significant part of the population that was Christian. And there was an idea that, well, maybe what's going wrong with Rome, right? Why we're falling apart and we're getting invaded and things are going badly for us, is we've forsaken the worship of the gods like we should. And Augustine's book, City of God, is a very lengthy, comprehensive answer to that accusation. And he points out that the gods have not helped Rome. The gods have not been good for Romans in general. And one thing to know about the way that the pagan gods were worshipped in Rome, and we'll get back to the baths in a minute, um, is that many of these pagan temples, in fact, almost all of them, were also places of entertainment. One of the things that would be done at a temple is a reenactment of specific events from this god's existence. And if you read any Roman mythology, you will find out that there's a lot of sex and violence going on. So a myth where this is actually a myth, right, where Zeus turns himself, Zeus, it's Jupiter in the Romans adopted the Greek gods, right? They changed their names. And so Zeus becomes Jupiter. And he turns himself into a swan and seduces a mortal woman. Um, there's some pretty freaky interspecies sexual stuff going on there. And that would have been depicted in the plays at the Temple of Jupiter. And so people like Augustine were just horrified by this. Like, look, this is terrible. Um, Also, the gladiatorial combats were going on, blood sports in the arena. This was another thing that Christians were not at all happy about and were criticizing Rome for. They felt that Rome had become um, completely corrupt. And there's a lot of corruption going on. You can just look at this, what this thing was like, right? Your average Roman citizen towards the end was not working at all, right? Rome was so wealthy that almost all of the work done was done by slaves. Um, the citizens in Rome, the capital of Rome, would have lived on basically a dole from the government, and the government provided for them free entertainment in the form of the scenic plays at the temples, which was sex and violence wall to wall, and also the blood sports in the Colosseum. And so you had a populace that was um, completely focused on entertaining themselves, and the baths were part of that entertainment. Um, the Romans were very lax with their sexual mores, especially towards the end. And sex with slaves was very, very common. It wasn't something you even questioned. Um, there's some evidence that there was. child rape and murder by one of the emperors, the things that Nero got up to, the thing that Nero's grandpa got up to. I'm blanking on his name, but there were some ugly, ugly things going on there. When you have absolute power over people, right, and no restraint, you get this kind of monstrosity, and this is what was going on in Rome. Um, Rome as a republic, as a living institution, was just not doing well at the center of it, and the pressure of all the people that Rome had conquered through all those years, pushing back against the borders of the empire, just became too great for them to overcome. And so Rome fell apart because of that. It is one of the main reasons that, especially someone like St. Augustine is going to say, well, you guys kind of deserve this. Look at what you did with your lives. And so, and another thing I want to talk about that it wasn't a question asked, but I want to focus on this for a minute. There was something desperately wrong with the Romans' social contract. Social contract is a term that comes from the Enlightenment thinkers in France, but it's a useful concept. Social contract is the unwritten agreement of all citizens in a particular place to obey the social constructs of that particular area. Um, we kind of take it for granted that people will obey the laws most of the time, right? But that's part of our social contract. Um, Someone who's speeding down the road going a million miles an hour, right? And the police pull that person over or try to pull the person over, and they don't pull over, right? The social contract, you can see this was an example of a way to think about the social contract. We will generally pull over when the police pull up behind us. If all of us stopped doing that, if we all, as a society, said, nah, we're not going to pull over when the police try to pull us over, the social contract has broken down, and it would end up in absolute chaos, right? One of the reasons the police get very interested in someone if they don't pull over is because they know, even instinctively, that this person is not on the same social contract as everyone else is. This is someone we need to get a hold of and talk to. And so, in the case of Rome, they had no way in their social contract to deal with the transfer of power. It's interesting, right? We think about kings and emperors mostly in terms of the medieval culture that comes after this, and we have this idea of primogeniture, right? The oldest son inherits the crown, and that might seem like a pretty awful way of doing that. Which, by the way, is how the world did this for a very long time until the American Revolution, basically. Um, but Rome didn't have anything like that. When an emperor died, there was literally no way of deciding who would be the next emperor. And after a while, it just became an absolute bloodbath. And among the things that were happening when Rome was falling apart and getting invaded, one year they went through 37 emperors, all of whom died by violence. Um, it got so bad that the Praetorian Guard, which was the elite fighting force that was basically served as police, keepers of order, and bodyguards to the emperors, right? Those guys began deciding who was going to be emperor and who wasn't. And if they didn't get what they wanted from the emperor, they simply assassinated him and put somebody else in there. This went on. And so at the time that Rome was absolutely declining, you have this population that is completely uninterested in doing anything in terms of their civic duty to the republic or anything. They are simply living on entertainment and free money and slaves. And at the very top of the social order, you have this absolute bloodbath going on. And so, the emperor might be assassinated, and you have another emperor for 3 weeks, and he gets assassinated. And the people that are sitting in the seats in the Colosseum don't notice this has happened. It's not altering their lives in any significant way. Another thing that contributed to Rome's decline was the legions just became so unbelievably powerful. But the first real Roman emperor, Augustus Caesar, basically he brought his army, his returning victorious army from his fight against the Gauls, he brought them straight into Rome and said, I'm the emperor. There was a law in Rome that you could not bring. A general had to disband their army before they entered the city. They couldn't bring their armed forces with them. There's a river called the Rubicon that's outside of Rome. And that was the limit. That was the line. You had to leave your army on the other side of the Rubicon. And that's where we get that phrase, crossing the Rubicon. It means I've committed myself to something that I cannot step back from. And that comes from Caesar crossing the Rubicon. And he marched into the capital and just took over. And that kind of began this chaos of just whoever was strongest, whoever was cunningest, whoever was cruelest could make themselves emperor of the world. And this created a tremendous amount of social upheaval, instability, chaos. And as brilliant as the Romans were, as organized as their society was, as they were one of the reasons the Roman soldiers stomped a mud hole in nearly everybody was they actually had tactics that worked. Right? They had division, they had command and control. They had all of these things that we associate with modern armies, and largely they were fighting against what they would consider barbarians, right? Folks with leather hide armor attacking individually. And it really wasn't too hard for the Roman legions just to bulldoze over most of the rest of the world because of their superiority in that way. And with all of this, they could not figure out a way to decide who would be the next emperor. And that just is bizarre to me. That's just a really odd thing, but it's absolute historical fact. And when I'm doing this one, the awkward pause, I'm looking around, I'm reading the next question, right? I'm just trying to think of how in the world I'm going to answer it. I do have some notes here, right? I'm working on this, but obviously I'm kind of making this up as I go. So these awkward pauses are going to happen. The question is, what was Ashoka's reasoning for wanting to spread Buddhism across the lands, since the idea of Buddhism as a religion is not based on caste systems, where one religion or person outranks another? Buddhism, of all the major religions, is probably the one you would think would be the least proselytizing. In other words, going out and trying to win converts, right? Because it's a very personal and internal thing. It's about a quest for enlightenment, and this is an interior journey that people take. The rise of Buddhism and Christianity, which we'll get into, we're going to move into that pretty soon, is a major, major change in the way that religion in general, just over worldwide, is thought about. Religion, Buddhism and Christianity are the only two religions that posit a universal problem with humanity. Something is wrong with us, and provide some kind of roadmap for how to fix that problem. Other religions, like nobody who was worshiping Jupiter said, I'm becoming more and more Jupiter-like, right? I'm becoming a better person because I worship Jupiter. That's not what religion was. And so, Buddhism and Christianity are very much kind of internal, becoming a better person, kind of things. But I want to point out that a human instinct, this is another thing that happens, and I don't know why, right? We just take this for granted. Anytime anyone thinks they have a good idea about the world, life, the universe, and everything, their next instinct is, I'm going to make everyone else believe this too. And I'm not sure why that is. I don't know what that instinct is. And a great deal of tragedy and harm and all kinds of ugliness has happened in the world as a result of this instinct of, instead of saying, oh wow, I've achieved enlightenment, this is great for me, I'm just going to hang out my enlightened self. The next thing is, well, I have to make my neighbor become enlightened too. And this leads to problems, or it can lead to problems. And it's just something that people do. And it doesn't matter. It's not just with religion, politics, anything. Football teams, right? People try to convince you that the Sooners are the best or the Cowboys aren't, whatever. It's something we do as human beings, and I don't think it's for the most part helpful to us. We seem to make a lot of mistakes along those lines. Next question is, you hear stories like Romulus and Remus. Where did they get the ideas of people being raised by animals? And this is an interesting thing about Rome. Rome had two mutually exclusive founding stories. So they have, foundational mythology is the myths that a culture tells itself to define who they are. Well, Rome has two of them, and they don't coincide with one another. They don't dovetail together. They're two completely different stories. The one is that Aeneas, which was one of the nobles in Troy after the Trojan War, he's a refugee. He moves a little further away into Italy, and was now Italy, and founds Rome. That's one foundational myth. It's in just as the Greeks had Homer and the Iliad and Odyssey, the Romans had the Aeneid by Virgil. And it was exactly the same kind of thing. It's a massive epic of this story of the survivors of Troy founding a new republic. And then the other story is odd. It's about these two brothers, Romulus and Remus, and they are abandoned in the wilderness. And by the way, this is a story you'll see again and again in ancient literature. We already talked about it some, going all the way back to Egypt and Sumeria. Um, you know, the noble being, the person who is the best, being abandoned in the wilderness and cared for in some way. Right? We do this with King Arthur. Right? King Arthur is out in the wilderness. He's hidden away by Merlin. He doesn't know he's a king until he pulls the sword out of the stone. This is the kind of story that humans like to tell themselves. And the story of Romulus and Remus is one of those kinds of stories. Raised by wolves. Now you can think about, we can only speculate, right? Why is that attractive? Well, wolves are ferocious things, right? If your founding rulers were raised by wolves, then that means they might be pretty formidable people. But the story gets odd quickly. They found a city, right, Rome, and Remus jumps over the city wall and shows off his prowess as a physically imposing person. And Romulus gets jealous and kills him. And that's how Romulus becomes the founder of Rome, according to that particular foundational myth, which once again has nothing to do with the myth about Aeneas and the survivors of Troy. So the Romans are kind of mixed up at the very base of who they are in terms of their founding mythology. And if you think about the problem that they have, right, that goes onward, that eventually brings them down, one of the main problems, this inability to settle peacefully who is going to be the ruler of Rome. Well, that's right there in their foundational mythology. Romulus kills his own brother to become the ruler of Rome. And so I don't know what to say about that, right? Some foundational myths have negative things in them that still end up being foundational, right? That's how the Romans ordered their culture from then on. Civil wars and emperors assassinating other emperors, or generals rising up and assassinating the emperor. This is part of the ugliest part of the history of Rome. And like I said, it goes right back to the story of Romulus and Remus. Why was the Athenian democracy mainly based on their citizens' ability to have others do their work? This is a great question and insightful, because you're probably noticing, right? There's a whole lot of things going on in this ancient world, where we're hearing about rulers and emperors and armies and artists and all this stuff. But who's doing all the work, right? Slavery was universal in the ancient world. There's no culture that does not have slavery as its foundation. It's the way society was organized all over the planet. That's just how things were done, right? The history of the ancient world is full of rebellions and usurpations and wars and conflicts and stuff, but there aren't any strikes, right? You never hear about the workers going on strike, or we're not doing this anymore. The people who did the work of the world had no choice. And that's simply the way the world was organized, and was organized for a very, very, very long time. And it's kind of one of the shameful things about our American history, is that we were the last civilized, part of the world to give up on this idea. And there's also some significant differences between the slavery of the ancient world and the slavery of America. America's slavery was based on a faulty idea about racial inferiority, whereas the ancient world slavery was simply based on who got conquered by whom. The Roman might have a Phoenician slave, right? Not thinking that the Phoenician slave is somehow genetically inferior, just your whole culture got stomped on by my culture, and so now you do my work for me. It's a kind of a different attitude towards the people who were the slaves. But that's the way the whole world looked in that age. It was never questioned, not at all. In fact, one of the books of Paul, one of the very tiny little letters, Titus, in the New Testament, is about Paul sending an escaped slave. The slave has escaped, has run away from their master, and they have run into Paul. Paul has converted the slave to Christianity, and Paul also earlier converted the slave's master, whom the slave had run away from, to Christianity. And the letter is to be carried back to this master by the slave. And basically Paul's saying, this guy stole himself from you, and I'm returning him. But since you're both of you are Christians, you need to treat one another well. Right? That's kind of the gist of this thing. But Paul doesn't question the legitimacy of slavery. It just is something that's in the world. No, it was a universal feature of the way the world looked, and so um, it wasn't really something that anyone questioned the goodness of. Right? It's just this is the way things happened. And if you had talked to a person from Roman civilization, for instance, and said, "Well, there's going to be a future world with no slaves," they would just lose their minds. Like, how will anything get done? They would not be able to figure it out. They would have no concept of wages, of working for wages, and this kind of thing that we do now. We have a lot of other kinds of problems in our modern world, our present world, because of this, that slavery just doesn't bother with, right? When you have slaves, there's a whole lot of stuff you don't worry about. And one of those things is how's stuff getting done. And so that's just the way the world was. Um, Here's an interesting question. I like this one. Why does Disney insist on painting such a pretty picture of history, right? Disney does this. They take these stories from the ancient world, like myths and fairy tales, different kinds of stories that are just kind of stories people like to tell, and they turn them into these animated things. And it's always sugarcoating what's going on, right? Um, well, Disney does this because they know they can't sell tickets otherwise. It's part of why they do it. But it's kind of interesting how much they paper over this stuff, right? The person that asked this question referenced the Emperor's New Groove, right, which is about a ruler in the Inca civilization. The Incas were doing human sacrifice quite a bit. Um, during the time frame that the Emperor's New Groove would have happened in, and somehow that doesn't really make it into the story, right? Um, yeah, if you're going to get your understanding of history from Disney, you're going to be sadly misinformed and misinformed about some of the more brutal and darker sides of this, which are always present. And it's kind of something I want to make something that we look at in this class. Think about, why is it we do this? Why do human beings create all this pain and misery in their world? And we just do. Um, uh, there is no utopia, right? There's no place where people are just, hey, everything's fine, we're doing great here. Um, Everywhere you look, there's some kind of injustice or tragedy or so many things go wrong that people could easily fix, and we don't. And there's plenty of food in the world, for instance. Everyone should eat. And the fact that we don't, that large parts of the world go hungry, is not a failure of our ecosystem to provide the sustenance. It's a failure of human beings. It's a failure of human structures to make sure something basic, like everyone has enough to eat, can happen. Um, this is a funny one. Just as a little side, the question was, I wonder if people who get Chinese writing tattooed on them really know what they have permanently put on their bodies. I put a web link to this interesting story about this young lady who had a Chinese tattoo, and it ended up being the name of Jeremy Lin, the basketball player. She thought it was something like, I don't know, peace and prosperity. I don't know what she thought it said. It probably says in the story. It's been a while since I saw this. But yeah, you can do that, right? If you don't know what Chinese writing is, you can get a tattoo that you regret down the road, right? Now, people here may not look at it oddly, but if you show up in China with some weird thing drawn on you, then maybe it'd be a problem. But you probably should double check these things if you're considering this kind of tattoo. Um, why were the women of Athens considered not citizens? Um, Gosh, this I can't. I'll go into this in more depth and detail as we go. And it's just too big of a question to answer. Why are women? I want to ask a more broad question. Right? Why are women in general across human culture treated badly, right? Or given less than full status as citizens or as human beings? You see it everywhere. It's part of this odd thing about the way the world looks. And um, in the case of the Greeks and the Romans, there's this kind of peculiar thing about the way they looked at women. Um, if you look at most ancient mythology that comes out of these cultures, the women are terrifying. The story of Medea, there's a myth of Jason and the Argonauts, right? This is a Greek myth. And there have been several feature films on Jason and the Argonauts. It's a great adventure where this guy, Jason, he gets all these heroes together and they get this awesome ship called the Argo, and they go on this epic journey to get this golden fleece, this magical golden thing, and bring it back. And the story always ends with them getting the golden fleece. Um, how this happens is the ruler who has the golden fleece, or his daughter, whose name's Medea. She's a magician. She's a sorceress. She helps Jason do this and escape. And that's where the movie ends. But that's not where the myth ends. The myth ends with Jason being an older guy, midlife crisis kind of thing. He's been on this great adventure. He's done these awesome things. And he's not satisfied with things as they are anymore. He's going to get a new wife, this king's daughter that he wants to marry. And Medea's not having it. And it ends in all kinds of disaster and horror and bloodshed and ugly stuff, because Medea is not going to put up with this. You see this again and again and again in this mythology. The women are terrifying in so many ways. Hercules is killed by his wife in a fit of jealousy, for instance. And this is even in Nordic mythology. There's all these kinds of, you see these women showing up on the scene that are formidable people. And you have your goddesses that are powerful. And yet, within these same cultures, women were not given full status as this odd kind of double standard, right? That women are seen as both fearful and as things, property. Oddness there. And it's still with us, by the way. It's still with us, and it's devastating people's brains right now. If you've been paying attention at all to the stuff with the incels and the people who are so unhappy about women being able to be sexual beings, right? When they feel left out, you see this double standard, that worship of women and hatred of them at the same time, attraction to and fear of, operating in the same people, and it makes them crazy. And ancient mythology is full of that kind of thing. Why was Christianity a major threat to the Romans? And I'm just going to refer you back to Augustine, right? Augustine he's the guy to read if you want to understand this history more in detail. But Christianity overthrew paganism, and Rome was built on paganism. And Christianity has upended all of that stuff. Augustine argues that the gods, he says the gods are one of several different things, combinations thereof. There's good evidence that many of these gods were simply invented by the rulers of that part of the world. When you have foundation mythology and you have gods to worship, you can organize a society around that. And so they just invented these things out of thin air. There's other evidence that says that many of these gods were simply living people from prehistory who did mighty and amazing things, and then they were adored so much that they gained the status of gods. And you can see that happening right now in North Korea with Kim Jong-un and his dad, right now, the worship, the cult of personality and worship of these people. That'd be a great example of a modern example of a human being becoming a god. The shrines, they have shrines and temples to the original Kim Jong-il, or I forget there's three of them now, right? The original one that separated North Korea from everywhere else, and then his son and his son. We're down 3 generations into this, and each one of them is treated like a god. And so that's one of the things Augustine said the gods were. And the other thing he said they were was demons. He's like, these are evil spiritual beings who have embodied these statues and these idols and these temples as a way of getting people to worship them. And that's what Christianity saw paganism as. And so the people who were pagans, right, they're not too happy about this. And Christianity was seen as an enormous threat to this. And so you have a lot of early on, as Christianity arises, periods of persecution. We all have the idea of the Christians being thrown to the lions. Well, that's what was going on. The Christians were not getting with the program of worshiping the gods, is specifically of the god of the emperor. You know, one of the things that the emperors did was they gave themselves a divine title. And no one thought they were gods, right? No one really thought the emperor was a god. Otherwise, you don't assassinate a god, right? Everyone knew this was a fiction in interest of promoting stability in the culture. So if we're going to have an absolute ruler, well, we're going to treat him like a god. And so the emperor would have his own little statue in the pantheon, you know, and the Christians just would not offer sacrifice to it. They would not do it. And that made them the enemies of the republic. And you know, Christianity won. You know, look, think about all the cultures. The mighty Carthage, Hannibal was not able to defeat Rome, but Christianity did it without fighting a single battle. They just didn't. It was a transformation of human beings, and eventually enough people in the empire became Christians that paganism just died out. There was no war between Christians and pagans. That didn't happen. You did have persecution of pagans against Christians, and then the other way around. Some right human beings do this. We generally treat one another badly. But there was never a pitched battle between the forces of Christianity and the forces of paganism. It's not how that happened. Many of the early churches were situated within ancient pagan temples, not because the Christians kicked the pagans out. The pagans stopped going there. They were empty buildings, and the Christians are like, well, let's use this. This is awesome. This will work. And that's, you know, one of the odd moments in history, this entire overthrow of a whole way of looking at the world that had been going on forever and ever, changing as a result of this new idea, a new way of thinking about the world, of thinking about human beings, and you know, what our universe looks like. This is a fact. I love this stuff, right? The question about China, right? In chapter 7, the question is in chapter 7, the book says that several times that Emperor Qin's actual tomb has never been excavated. Why is that? Well, Qin is the first great emperor of China, right? He's the unified China. It's this amazing, you know, civilization they built. And when he died, they made a gigantic pyramid. It's bigger than the pyramids in Egypt. And there were stories about what was in this pyramid. And for a very long time, people thought these were complete exaggerations. These were just, you know, mythologizing what's happened here. One of the things that was said to be buried with this guy was his entire army. That there was this giant army of statues, each one made to look individually like the person in the army. So no mass man. Each one of these things made by hand, each with a different expression, a different face, different individually, thousands and thousands of them. People thought there's no way, and then they found them. Right, the Terracotta Army. I'll put a link to that so you can kind of explore that some more. It's really cool, right? And they haven't unearthed all of it yet. They're just still doing this. They're finding this enormous army that was made and then buried with this guy. And so that leads people to think that the other things that are described about this tomb might also be true. In the interior of the tomb, in the burial chamber, there is a scale model of China with the emperor's tomb, right, being the place of golden sarcophagus where the solid gold, where the emperor is buried, or he's in that thing, right, that's where his body is. And then all of the stars in the sky are in the dome. This is a giant dome-like chamber within the pyramid. The stars are actual diamonds and rubies and precious gems thousands and thousands and thousands of them in the ceiling of this chamber. And the lakes and rivers are pure mercury. There's also, they said, the legend is that there are these lamps, right, that were fed by these enormous reservoirs of oil, so large that if they're correct, those lamps may still be burning. In other words, if anybody finally gets in there, they might find the place lit up. The problem with this is, if you've got several hundreds of thousands of gallons of raw mercury in this thing, and it's been there for a very long time, it's going to kill you if you try to get into it. And that is the major obstacle to trying to get into this thing to find out what's really there. These things fascinate me. This is another story. It's not totally tangential, not about China or Rome, but in India, there's a temple. You guys look this up. It's true stuff. Right? It's real, actual, real thing. Rumored that legendary, right? That there were these treasure chambers beneath this ancient Hindu temple. Well, they finally dug in there and found $2 trillion worth of precious gems, solid gold. Huge statues of Vishnu that are made of solid gold. This is an enormous, unbelievable treasure. And the coolest thing is there's like 6 chambers, and there's they've gotten into 5 of them, and the 6th one has the scariest looking door you have ever seen. I'll put a link to it on below this video. And the inscription on the door says, "Don't open this one, a vampire lives here." So nobody's opened it. That's just too cool to be true, right? But it is. So that's why Emperor Qin's tomb has not been excavated. Last thing we'll talk about, because this is another cool thing, is the Persian invasion. If you've seen the movie The 300, it is a very stylized and fictionalized version of that actual event in history. And Greece organized itself around city-states, and each city had its own laws and its own ethos, its own kind of way of being. And while Athens was all about learning and wisdom and science and math and all this stuff, Sparta was all about war. That's all they did. They trained to be warriors. And the Spartans were the undefeated heavyweight champions of the ancient world when it came to warfare. They didn't lose a battle for centuries. When they finally did, it was like this earth-shattering event. The Spartans had been beaten, right? When Xerxes brought an army of the contemporary numbers, say 1 million people, he's going to invade Greece. He had this enormous, unstoppable army that was just going to roll over Greece and make Greece part of the Persian Empire. And because this is long before there's any kind of telegraph or telephone or wireless, you only figure out you're getting invaded by the Persians by somebody seeing them showing up. And so this is kind of happening by surprise, and they know the Persians are going to be attacking through the mountains at this place called Thermopylae. And the king of Sparta, Leonidas, brought 300 of his best warriors that they had, and they went into that gap. There's this one little narrow pass that only about 20 people can stand in shoulder to shoulder. And they blocked that gap up with their soldiers. And Xerxes sent wave after wave after wave of his warriors into that gap and lost all of them. The estimates are that the Persians lost 60,000 people in that battle against 300. It's a historic. It happened, and this is one of the great legends and stories of Greece. Because once you've had your head handed to you like that, now eventually the treachery happened, right? This guy told Xerxes about a way to get around the mountain passes and get behind the Spartans, and so they were all eventually massacred, but at such an enormous cost to the Persian army. Imagine the morale of your army after that, right? Okay, 300 of these guys took out 60,000 of us, and we're going to go have to fight a whole lot more of them. Um, Xerxes' invasion of Greece came to a grinding halt, um, and that combined with an enormous naval battle that he lost at the same time, basically did away with any chance the Persians would have of ruling Greece. Um, and that's that. I will try to get to your next lecture on Sunday night instead of Monday, but this one took me some time to put together. Um, keep paying attention to the course messages, and let's keep rolling through the semester. What time is it? It's 10:54 right now. The first test is due by midnight. I'm looking anxiously at you guys. I can see in progress, like you're working on this thing and you're killing me. Like, get this done. Um, so I will see you guys again next week.